He was running out of time, and he knew it. In a dimly lit workshop on the outskirts of Düsseldorf, where the autumn rain of 1942 hammered against steel roofing like mortar fire, Louis Stange held a prototype rifle that should not have existed. The metal was still warm from the test firing 20 minutes earlier, cordite hung in the cold air. And somewhere in the dark archives of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, a single order waited: deliver the impossible, or watch the Fallschirmjäger die in the next jump. The FG-42, Fallschirmjägergewehr 42, sat on the workbench between them. Impossibly light, impossibly complex, a weapon that violated every principle of firearms design Stange had learned in 30 years of engineering. 7 kilograms, full automatic capability, precision out to 500 meters. A rifle that could survive a parachute drop into combat and still fire the moment boots hit ground. His deputy, Werner Gruner, stood at the far end of the bench, arms crossed, face drawn. The feed mechanism jammed again. Stange didn't look up. How many rounds? 18, same as last time. The crisis had been written in blood over the limestone cliffs of Crete 16 months earlier. May 1941. The Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's airborne elite, had leaped from Ju-52 transport planes into what intelligence promised would be a swift operation. They jumped armed only with pistols and grenades, their rifles, machine guns, heavy weapons, all of it packed separately in metal canisters, dropped across the battlefield in a pattern that assumed speed and shock would carry the day. Reality had been different. British, Greek and Commonwealth forces had massacred the descending paratroopers in mid-air and slaughtered those who landed defenseless, scrambling through olive groves for weapons containers they could not find. By the time the Germans finally secured Crete, they had lost over 6,000 men, more than a quarter of the invasion force. Hitler had been horrified. Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, humiliated. And the Fallschirmjäger survivors had carried a single burning demand back to Germany. Never again would they jump without a real weapon in their hands. The solution seemed simple: give them a lighter rifle. But every option had failed. The standard Karabiner 98K was a bolt-action relic. The MP-40 submachine gun lacked range and stopping power. The MG-34 machine gun weighed 15 kilograms and required a crew. What the paratroopers needed was something that did not exist in any army's arsenal, a weapon that combined the sustained fire of a machine gun with the precision of a marksman's rifle, light enough to carry in a jump, yet powerful enough to stop an enemy at combat range. The engineering community had laughed. Senior officers had called it fantasy. Stange turned back to the workbench. "We're not changing the design." Gruner's jaw tightened. "Louis, the Waffenamt inspector is coming Thursday. If the feed mechanism jams again, then we fix the feed mechanism. We don't compromise the concept." He had grown up in the mechanical heartland of Germany, the son of a toolmaker who had taught him that every problem could be solved if you studied it long enough with clear eyes. He remembered the First War, not as a soldier but as a child, watching his uncles return broken, speaking in fragments about trenches and machine guns that jammed in the mud. He had learned early that weapons were not romantic. They were tools, and bad tools killed the men who carried them. When the call had come from Rheinmetall to lead the FG-42 project, Stange had been 51 years old. Too old for glory, too experienced for illusions. He had accepted the mission knowing it might be impossible. He had also accepted it knowing that impossibility had never stopped desperate men before. The first challenge had been weight. A machine gun's sustained firepower requires mass to absorb recoil and heat. A paratrooper's rifle requires lightness to survive the jump and the sprint after landing. These demands are opposites. Stange's answer had been heretical: strip everything. Remove every gram that does not contribute to function. The receiver would be milled from a single block of steel, but made thinner than safety regulations recommended. The barrel would be chrome-lined for durability, but slender, almost fragile-looking. The stock would be stamped metal, not carved wood. The weapon would have no unnecessary beauty, no parade ground shine. Pure function, borderline skeletal. Then came the firing mechanism, the real impossibility. The FG-42 needed to fire from a closed bolt for semi-automatic accuracy and from an open bolt for full automatic cooling. No rifle in the world did both. Stange had designed a dual-mode system that shifted mechanically depending on the selector switch, a solution so elegant that even Gruner, after 3 weeks of testing, had stopped arguing. But elegance on paper meant nothing if the feed mechanism jammed on round 18. Stange pulled out a folder thick with test reports, casualty figures from Crete, and a single photograph. A Fallschirmjäger lying face down in an olive grove, one arm outstretched toward a weapons container 20 meters away. "Look at this." Gruner didn't move. "I've seen it." "Then look at it again." Gruner crossed to the desk, stared at the photograph. That man jumped knowing he had no weapon. He jumped because doctrine said he would find one on the ground. Doctrine was wrong. And he died for it. Stange closed the folder. "We fix the feed mechanism. We don't change the concept." Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the workshop smelled of gun oil and failure and something harder to name. The weight of being right when no one believes you yet. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments. And stay with us for the next chapters. The weeks that followed were an education in institutional resistance. Every morning, Stange arrived at the Rheinmetall workshop before dawn, when Düsseldorf was still wrapped in pre-winter fog. He would make coffee on the small burner, strong and bitter, and spread the previous day's test reports across the workbench like a surgeon preparing for difficult surgery. The feed mechanism remained the central problem. The FG-42's side-mounted magazine required a feed angle that no existing rifle had attempted, too steep, and rounds would nosedive into the chamber and jam, too shallow, and the magazine would protrude awkwardly. Stange had calculated the optimal angle down to a single degree, but calculation and reality were not always the same thing. By mid-October 1942, they had built and tested 4 variants. All 4 had jammed. Werner Gruner began arriving later each morning. Small acts of withdrawal. Stange noticed, but said nothing. A man who doubts the mission will always find small ways to distance himself from failure. The first official rejection from the Waffenamt had arrived in late September, typed on heavy paper with all the bureaucratic courtesy of a funeral announcement. While the technical ambition of the FG-42 project is acknowledged, procurement cannot recommend full-scale production given current resource constraints and unresolved reliability concerns. The Heereswaffenamt has determined that existing weapons platforms adequately meet operational requirements for airborne forces. Gruner had read the letter twice, then set it down carefully. "They're telling us to quit. They're telling us they won't pay for it." Stange folded the letter and placed it in the file cabinet, next to the photograph from Crete. "Existing weapons platforms adequately meet operational requirements." That's what they wrote. Yes, 6,000 men died on Crete because existing weapons platforms did not meet operational requirements. The resistance from procurement was not malicious. Stange understood that. It was simply the natural response of a system designed to minimize risk. The Waffenamt operated on proven principles: standardization, mass production, incremental improvement. The FG-42 violated all 3. It required precision machining that German factories, already straining under the demands of total war, could barely sustain. And it was expensive. Each FG-42 would require over 200 man-hours to produce. The Karabiner 98K took less than 20, but numbers did not tell the whole story. The Waffenamt saw airborne forces as a category with operational requirements that could be met with existing platforms. But they did not see the Fallschirmjäger scrambling through olive groves, unarmed, dying before they could even fight. The first breakthrough came by accident, as most breakthroughs do. It was late November. Stange had been at the workshop for 14 hours straight, making microscopic adjustments to the feed ramp angle. Gruner had gone home hours earlier. The workshop was cold, the coffee was gone, and the latest test had produced the same result: 18 rounds, then a jam. Stange was too tired to be angry. He simply sat at the workbench, holding the magazine in one hand and the rifle in the other. Then he noticed something. The magazine lips, the small metal guides at the top that controlled how cartridges fed into the weapon, were flexing slightly under spring pressure. Not much, a fraction of a millimeter, but enough. Enough to change the feed angle just as the 18th round entered the chamber. The problem was not the rifle. The problem was the magazine. Stange picked up the phone. It was past midnight, but there was one man at Rheinmetall who would still be awake. Friedrich Kopp answered on the third ring. "This better be important, Louis. The magazine lips are flexing under load. We need to reinforce them." A pause. "How much flexing?" 0.3 millimeters, maybe less. That's nothing. That's everything." Another pause. "Longer this time. I'll be there in an hour." Kopp arrived with a thermos of coffee and tools Stange recognized from his father's collection: spring steel files, precision calipers, the instruments of men who understand that engineering is not about grand gestures, but about noticing the small things that matter. They worked through the night, reinforcing the magazine lips with a subtle ridge of hardened steel. By dawn, they had modified 3 magazines. By noon, they had tested all 3. Each one fed 40 rounds without a single jam. Gruner arrived at the workshop just after 1 in the afternoon and found Stange asleep at the workbench, head on his arms, empty magazines scattered around him like spent shell casings. He picked up the test report, read it twice. Then he made fresh coffee and waited for Stange to wake. When Stange finally stirred, Gruner slid the report across the bench. 40 rounds, all 3 magazines, 0 failures. For the first time in months, Gruner smiled. "We should tell the Waffenamt." "We will. But this time we show them, not just tell them." Outside, winter was settling over Düsseldorf. Inside, the modified magazines sat on the workbench like small victories against impossible odds. The FG-42 was not finished, but for the first time, it felt possible. Winter came early to Düsseldorf that year. By December 1942, the workshop windows were glazed with frost each morning, and the metal components of the FG-42 were so cold they burned bare skin on contact. Stange took to wearing his father's old work gloves, leather worn soft with age, the fingertips carefully cut away for precision work. The magazine breakthrough should have changed everything. In a rational system, it would have. 40 rounds without failure, consistent feed angle, reliable function. The numbers were undeniable. But numbers were not always enough to overcome institutional inertia. The Waffenamt's response arrived 3 weeks after Stange submitted the new test results. While improved magazine reliability is noted, fundamental concerns regarding production feasibility and tactical doctrine remain unresolved. The Fallschirmjäger units have adapted successfully to current equipment configurations. Further investment in the FG-42 project cannot be justified at this time. Gruner read the letter standing up. "They're saying no. They're saying not yet. And how do we get field results without production authorization?" Stange folded the letter carefully. "We find another way. But finding another way required allies, and allies were becoming scarce. The war was not going as planned. Stalingrad was a frozen nightmare consuming divisions. North Africa was slipping away. In this context, asking for resources to build a rifle that the procurement office had rejected twice felt less like persistence and more like delusion. His wife, Margaret, brought him dinner one evening in mid-December. She set it on his desk without a word and sat in the chair across from him. "You're not sleeping." "I'm sleeping enough." "Louis, they've said no twice. Maybe they're right." "They're not right." "How do you know?" He wanted to say, "Because I've seen the photograph." Because 6,000 men died on Crete, and no one will admit that existing weapons platforms failed them. Instead, he said, because the problem is real, and real problems require real solutions. Margaret looked at the prototype FG-42 lying among the blueprints. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, but I'd rather be wrong trying than right and silent. She left the dinner and took the empty coffee cups. At the door, she paused. Your father would be proud, or worried. I'm not sure which. Both, probably. The external pressure intensified through January 1943. News from the Eastern Front grew darker. The Wehrmacht was learning what Napoleon had learned, that Russia consumed armies and returned only silence. The Fallschirmjäger, once the glamorous tip of the spear, seemed increasingly irrelevant. Stanger read the operational reports with growing dread, not because they suggested the FG-42 was unnecessary, but because they suggested the Fallschirmjäger themselves might be phased out. And if the Fallschirmjäger disappeared, so would the mission. So would the weapon. Then, in early February, a visitor arrived. Stange did not recognize him at first, a Luftwaffe Hauptmann in a winter greatcoat standing in the workshop doorway. Young, maybe 30, face carrying the particular weariness of someone who has seen combat and lived to question it. Herr Stanger? Yes. The Hauptmann stepped inside and closed the door against the cold. My name is Klaus Dietrich. I was at Crete. Stanger set down the barrel assembly he had been examining. Friedrich Kopp is my uncle. He told me you're working on a new rifle. Dietrich moved closer to the workbench. His eyes found the FG-42 immediately. May I? Stanger nodded. Dietrich picked up the rifle with careful reverence, checked the weight, the balance, the sight picture, worked the bolt, examined the magazine well, set it down gently. This is what we needed on Crete. The Waffenamt disagrees. The Waffenamt wasn't there. A silence settled between them. Finally, Dietrich spoke again. I lost half my company looking for weapons canisters. Good men who jumped knowing they had no rifle because doctrine said we didn't need rifles in the aircraft. Doctrine was wrong, and they paid for it. He turned to face Stange directly. Whatever you need to make this weapon real, tests, reports, testimonials, I'll provide it. My entire company will. Because we remember what it costs to jump defenseless. Stange felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but the recognition that he was not alone, that the conviction he carried in silence was shared by men who had earned the right to speak. The Waffenamt says the Fallschirmjäger have adapted successfully to current equipment. Dietrich's laugh was short and bitter. Adapted, yes. We adapted by dying less stupidly. He picked up the FG-42 again. How soon can you make more of these? If we had production authorization, 6 months for the first batch. And if you don't have authorization, then we keep working and hope someone in command sees what we see before it's too late. Dietrich nodded slowly. There may be another way. Give me 2 weeks. At the threshold, he paused. My uncle says you're stubborn. He means it as a compliment. I know. Good. Because you're going to need it. After Dietrich left, Gruner stood beside Stange in silence. Outside, the winter afternoon was already fading to grey. You think he can help? Stange picked up his father's calipers and turned them slowly in the dim light. I think sometimes the right help comes from the people who have the most to lose if we fail. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. Klaus Dietrich kept his promise. 2 weeks after his visit to the Düsseldorf workshop, a classified memo arrived at Rheinmetall's administrative offices. Friedrich Kopp walked into the workshop late one afternoon, carrying a single sheet of paper and wearing an expression somewhere between satisfaction and disbelief. You're going to want to read this. The memo was brief, signed by a General Oberst in the Luftwaffe High Command. It requested a priority technical evaluation. of the FG-42 prototype to be conducted by a select group of Fallschirmjäger officers with recent combat experience. The evaluation was to be held at the Rheinmetall facility within the next 30 days. It was not production authorization, but it was official acknowledgement that the weapon deserved serious consideration. Gruner read the memo 3 times. How did Dietrich manage this? Kopp leaned against the workbench. His company commander survived Crete. So did half a dozen other officers. They've been writing reports, filing complaints. No one listened because they were junior officers challenging doctrine. But when you get enough junior officers saying the same thing, eventually someone senior has to at least pretend to care. And this General Oberst lost a son at Crete, a lieutenant in the 3rd Fallschirmjäger, jumped without a rifle, never found his weapons canister. Stange set down the memo carefully. When is the evaluation? March 15th, 3 weeks. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Stange's life. He and Gruner rebuilt the prototype from scratch, replacing every component that showed even marginal wear. They tested each mechanism separately until the numbers became mantras. They fired 5,000 rounds through the weapon in bursts and single shots, hot and cold, clean and deliberately fouled with mud. The FG-42 performed flawlessly. But Stange had learned not to trust perfection. Perfection in a workshop did not guarantee reliability in combat. March 15th arrived cold and clear. The 8 Fallschirmjäger officers arrived at the Rheinmetall facility just after dawn. Stange recognized Klaus Dietrich immediately. The others were strangers, older, harder, carrying themselves with the particular wariness of men who have learned not to believe in miracles. The senior officer, a major named Erich Walter, examined the FG-42 without touching it. "This is the weapon." "Yes, Herr Major. 7 kilograms, 6.6, fully loaded." Walter picked up the rifle, examined the receiver, the side-mounted magazine, the integrated bipod, worked the bolt, checked the selector switch, set it down. "The Waffenamt says it jams. The early prototypes did. This one doesn't." "That's what you say. That's what 5,000 test rounds say. We'll see." The evaluation lasted 4 hours. The officers fired from prone positions, standing positions, and after simulated parachute drops where the weapon was thrown to the ground from 2 meters up. They fired single shots and full bursts. They fired with clean ammunition and with rounds deliberately exposed to dirt and moisture. They fired until the barrel was hot enough to raise blisters and then kept firing. The FG-42 functioned perfectly. By midday, the atmosphere had changed. The skepticism had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else: interest, calculation, the slow recognition that perhaps this impossible weapon was not impossible after all. During a break, Dietrich approached Stange. "They're impressed. Walter won't say it, but he is. Impressed enough to recommend production. That depends on what happens in the field trial." "Field trial?" Dietrich smiled slightly. "You didn't think this was the only test, did you? The final evaluation was a timed combat simulation. 5 officers would attack a fortified position while 3 defended it, all using the FG-42. The simulation lasted 18 minutes. Rifle fire echoed across the range in sharp, controlled bursts. The FG-42s cycled smoothly, magazines were changed quickly, and not a single weapon malfunctioned. Not one stoppage, not one failure. Walter approached Stange as the sun began its winter descent. "Herr Stange, I will be honest. When I arrived this morning, I expected to write a report explaining why this weapon is impractical. I have written many such reports. I understand. But I will not be writing that report today." Stange felt his chest tighten. "What will you write?" Walter looked back at the firing range. "I will write that the FG-42 is the most effective infantry weapon I have evaluated in 15 years of service. I will recommend immediate operational trials with a Fallschirmjäger company in a combat theater. and I will suggest that production authorization be granted with the highest priority." He turned back to Stange. "Whether the Waffenamt listens is another matter, but at least now they will hear it from combat officers, not just engineers." After the officers departed, Stange and Gruner stood alone in the workshop as twilight settled over Düsseldorf. The prototype FG-42 sat on the workbench, scarred from the day's testing, but intact. Gruner spoke first. "We did it. We proved it works. That's not the same as doing it." Stange picked up the rifle, felt its weight. Maybe they'll find another reason to say no, another objection, another delay. "You don't believe that." "I believe that being right and being heard are two different victories." Outside, the winter stars were emerging. Inside, the workshop smelled of cordite and possibility. The operational trial was scheduled for September 1943 in the mountains of Gran Sasso, Italy. The months between Walter's evaluation and actual combat deployment felt interminable. Procurement moved with glacial speed, forms to file, committees to brief, resource allocations to justify. But the momentum had shifted. Word of the successful evaluation spread through Fallschirmjäger units. Officers who had jumped at Crete wrote letters to their superiors. Combat veterans testified at procurement hearings. And slowly, grudgingly, the institutional machinery began to move. By August, Heinrich Krieghoff's facility in Suhl had produced the first batch of production FG-42s, 30 weapons, each one requiring over 200 man-hours of precision machining. Each one tested to the same standards Stange had set in Düsseldorf. On September 12, 1943, a small force of Fallschirmjäger launched Operation Oak, a daring glider assault to rescue Benito Mussolini from his mountain prison. Among them, Klaus Dietrich and 29 other paratroopers, each one carrying an FG-42. Stange was not there. He waited in Düsseldorf, monitoring fragmentary radio reports, drinking coffee that had long gone cold. Gruner sat across from him, saying nothing. Friedrich Kopp chain-smoked by the window. The first report came through at 16:47. Mission successful, target secured, 0 casualties. Kopp stubbed out his cigarette. They did it, but the real report, the one that mattered, arrived 3 days later in a handwritten letter from Klaus Dietrich. "Herr Stange, the FG-42 performed beyond expectation. We landed hot, under fire, in terrain where every second mattered. The weapon fired immediately, no jams, no failures. The integrated bipod allowed accurate suppressive fire from positions where a standard rifle would have been useless. The weight made movement possible even at altitude. More importantly, we jumped knowing we were armed. That changes everything. Not just tactically, but psychologically. We were not hoping to find a canister. We were ready the moment we hit ground. Every man in my unit wants one. This is the weapon we needed on Crete. With respect and gratitude, Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich." Stange read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the file cabinet, next to the photograph from Crete. Gruner was smiling. "The Waffenamt will have to authorize full production now." But Stange's expression was troubled. "Maybe, if there are enough resources, if the war doesn't change faster than production can scale." He was right to worry. The success at Gran Sasso was brilliant and bitter. The FG-42 had proven itself in the most public way possible, a spectacular rescue operation that made international headlines. Procurement could no longer deny its effectiveness. Production authorization was granted in October 1943. But by then, the strategic reality had shifted. The Luftwaffe's transport capacity was collapsing. Allied air superiority made large-scale airborne operations suicidal. Germany was losing on every front. The Fallschirmjäger, once an elite airborne force, were being deployed as ground infantry in desperate defensive battles. The weapon designed to solve a specific problem arrived in a war where that problem no longer existed. Krieghoff's facility produced fewer than 7,000 FG-42s across the entire war, not because the design failed, but because Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing, resource shortages, and the grinding attrition of total war. The weapon that was supposed to save the Fallschirmjäger became too rare to save anyone. Stanger watched it happen with a mixture of vindication and grief. He had been right. The FG-42 worked. Combat veterans testified to its effectiveness. American intelligence officers who examined captured weapons sent urgent reports back to ordnance departments. The Germans have solved a problem we did not know could be solved. But being right was not the same as winning. By late 1944, Stang was exhausted. The workshop in Düsseldorf felt less like a place of creation and more like a memorial to what might have been. Gruner had been conscripted into the Volkssturm. Kopp had disappeared into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. And the FG-42s that did make it to the front were being used by men fighting battles that no weapon could win. One evening in February 1945, as Allied bombers droned overhead and the walls shook with distant explosions, Stange sat alone in the workshop. The last prototype FG-42, the one that had survived 5,000 test rounds, the evaluation at Rheinmetall, and 2 years of impossible demands, sat on the workbench before him. He picked it up, felt its familiar weight. The metal was cold now. No cordite, no heat, just steel and silence. Margaret found him there an hour later. "Louis, we need to leave. The Americans will be here soon." "I know. What about the rifle?" Stange looked at the FG-42 one last time. Then he set it down gently. "It stays. Let someone else decide what it means." They left Düsseldorf 3 days later, carrying what little they could. The workshop was destroyed by bombing within the week, but the rifle survived. After the war, the FG-42 disappeared into the footnotes. Stange returned to what remained of Düsseldorf in late 1946. Rheinmetall was under Allied control, its facilities either destroyed or repurposed. The workshop where he had spent 2 years solving an impossible problem was rubble. But in the ruins, someone had salvaged the prototype. An American ordnance officer, recognizing something significant, had tagged it and sent it to Aberdeen Proving Ground for analysis. Stange never saw it again. He found work as a machinist in a small tool shop outside the city. The pay was poor, the work was simple, but it was honest, and after the war, honesty felt like enough. Werner Gruner had survived the Volkssturm and returned to engineering. They met occasionally for coffee, speaking little of the war or the weapon. Some things were too heavy to revisit casually. Friedrich Kopp had died in the final weeks of the Reich, killed in an air raid. His nephew, Klaus Dietrich, had survived the war and written once to Stanger, a brief letter thanking him again for the weapon and expressing something like survivor's guilt that it had come too late to matter, as it should have. The FG-42's legacy lived on in ways Stanger never witnessed. American and Soviet arms designers studied the captured weapons quietly. The side-feeding magazine, the dual bolt system, the emphasis on weight reduction. Concepts that seemed impossible in 1942 became foundational principles in post-war rifle development. The M60 machine gun borrowed ideas, the FN-FAL. Even early Soviet experiments with intermediate cartridges owed invisible debts to Stange's work. But his name appeared in none of the patents, none of the citations, none of the histories. The Fallschirmjäger veterans who survived carried strange, conflicted memories of the FG-42, the weapon that was perfect in their hands but arrived too late to save their comrades, too rare to equip more than a handful of units, too brilliant to be anything but a reminder of what might have been in a different war, under different circumstances. In 1962, a military historian researching German small arms development tracked Stanger down in his modest apartment in Düsseldorf. The historian was young, earnest, asking questions about design decisions and production challenges. Stange answered patiently, pulling out old blueprints he had kept, explaining the feed mechanism problem, the weight calculations, the dual bolt system. At the end of the interview, the historian asked one final question. Do you think the FG-42 would have made a difference if production had started earlier? If there had been enough of them? Stange was quiet for a long moment. The FG-42 solved a technical problem perfectly. But technical problems exist inside larger contexts. The problem wasn't just that paratroopers needed better rifles. The problem was that Germany was fighting a war it couldn't win with resources it didn't have. The FG-42 couldn't solve that. But it saved lives, Dietrich's letter said. It saved some lives, yes, and I'm grateful for that. But he paused, looking at the old blueprints spread across the table. I spent 2 years proving that something everyone said was impossible could be made real. And I was right, but being right didn't change what mattered. History isn't decided by the best weapons. It's decided by who can make enough of them, use them wisely, and fight for something worth defending. The historian wrote it down carefully. After he left, Stange sat alone with the blueprints. Outside, the rebuilt Düsseldorf hummed with the sounds of peacetime industry. Inside, the apartment was quiet. He thought of his father's calipers, long since lost. He thought of the workshop where impossible problems had slowly surrendered to stubborn precision. He thought of Klaus Dietrich jumping into Gran Sasso with an FG-42 slung across his chest, ready from the first moment. He thought of the men who had jumped at Crete with only hope. And he understood, finally, what the weapon meant. It was not a solution. It was a testament to the limits of solutions. A reminder that engineering brilliance cannot overcome strategic failure. That being right before anyone believes you is a particular kind of victory. Important, necessary, but not sufficient. The FG-42 endures now in museums and collectors' vaults. Military historians study it as a technical marvel, an evolutionary dead end that nonetheless influenced everything that came after. Fewer than 7,000 were made. Fewer still survived. But in the quiet archives of memory, among the Fallschirmjäger veterans who carried them, the FG-42 remains something else. The weapon that finally gave them what they needed, in a war that no longer allowed them to use it as intended. Stange died in 1970, quietly, largely forgotten. His obituary mentioned his work at Rheinmetall, but did not explain what he had created or why it mattered. But the weapon remembers, and so do the men who carried it. In the end, the FG-42 stands as a monument to a peculiar kind of tragedy, the tragedy of engineers who solved an impossible problem only to discover that impossibility was not the issue. The real enemy was time and industrial capacity and the grinding logic of a war that consumed brilliance as carelessly as it consumed lives. Some minds can imagine perfection even in the mouth of hell. And perfection, when it finally arrives, does not always save anyone, but it endures. As testament, as warning, as proof that being right when everyone says you're wrong is the hardest kind of victory, and sometimes the loneliest. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.